Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Joy. I'm the Executive Director for ULI Toronto, and I'm very pleased to present this, our final in our series of Future of Cities weekly discussions with Ryerson City Building Institute. Very exciting program to end this really incredibly well-received series. So thank you all for joining us. The first things I want to do is a little bit of housekeeping. If we could advance the slide, just those of you who've joined us before will know that we will have you on mute the whole time, as we've got quite a few people already, almost 225 people. That if you, and we're encouraging you to do this, submit questions using the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. We will endeavor to engage as many questions as we possibly can. As always, we can never address them all, but the questions you submit are questions that we will be using as future fodder for more webinars that we're planning to do in the future. So your questions are really important to us, whether we're able to directly get to them or not. And finally, this is being recorded and will be made available to members of ULI after the fact. And I said, finally, there's one more thing of housekeeping, and that is if you're tweeting, and we would love you to do that, please use the hashtag Future of Cities. I'd like now just to take a moment to thank our annual sponsors. This moment of COVID-19 and the months that will follow has been very, very challenging for all not-for-profits like ULI Toronto. And our reliance on our annual sponsors to keep the lights on of our organization so that we can present free webinars like this and the other programming and call to actions and the various things that we're doing, and there's a lot more to come, can only be made possible through the generous support of our annual sponsors, who we really, really thank. And many of them are on the call today, and we just are so grateful for your ongoing support. Thank you. Finally, it's now my honor to turn the podium to our moderator and our partner, Therese Berta, the Executive Director of Ryerson City Building Institute, who is going to drive our final program through today. Therese, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Yeah, this is our fifth and final webinar in our Future of Cities series. And during this series, we've been bringing together Ryerson experts with urban professionals to discuss current and pressing issues facing the future of urban design and policy impacted by COVID-19, including how we plan for density, climate, working, commuting, and the recovery of Main Street retail. And our topic today to end the series, the future of public space, couldn't be more relevant for everyone trying to physically distance, especially in the gorgeous weather we had this past weekend. So I'd like to introduce our panel. Next slide, please. Dr. Anne Harris is an epidemiologist and associate professor in Ryerson's School of Occupational and Public Health. One of her many areas of focus is active transportation, and we at CBI are excited because we are currently working with Anne on a study to examine the safety benefits of protected cycling lanes on Bloor Danforth. So thanks for joining us, Anne. And next slide, we also have with us Dave Harvey, who is Executive Director of Park People, which he founded almost 10 years ago, which is Canada's leading organization in city parks movement. I first met Dave in his previous role as Senior Advisor to Premier of Ontario on Environment, Natural Resources, and Municipal Affairs, including game-changing legislation and policy such as the Greenbelt Act and the Growth Plan. So welcome, Dave.
Thanks.
And to those of you who got up early this morning, you may have heard Anne and Dave on Metro Morning talking about today's webinar. And they were also on Ontario Morning talking about these issues. So they're all warmed up and we can get going. And just reminding listeners that we're going to be talking for about 25 minutes and then opening up to Q&A. So please use the Q&A chat box to ask your questions. Okay, great. So let's get started. So COVID-19 has exposed many of our city's existing urban challenges with public space. So whether it's not enough park space or unequal access to space or crowding, we want to begin by asking each of you, when it comes to parks or public realm, what challenges have you seen really brought to light during this pandemic, and what inequalities are exposed? Dave, we're going to start with you and talking about parks.
Yeah, and I'm just going to start with an upside to COVID, because I think everyone will agree that, you know, we've seen our parks and green spaces used and appreciated like absolutely never before. As a parks organization, you know, I'm absolutely astounded at the number of people out there. And I think part of the thing we're going to talk about in today's webinar is like how to handle all those crowds and how to, you know, create more spaces and so we can all be done safely. But it's just been so fantastic to see how vital parks have been to helping during COVID and the role that they will play going forward as we try to recover in the coming months and how we'll be you know, transforming our societies. So it's great to see, and it just reinforces our belief, but I think it's more commonly held now that, you know, parks are just absolutely core urban infrastructure. It's not a nice little have amenity. It's as essential as roads or water or sewer. So it's just been incredible to see. And again, an upside I really like to point out is that around the GTA, we've seen conservation authorities in Rouge Park close their parks, but, you know, municipalities have kept their parks open, and that's been a really positive thing. We have seen other cities like Halifax and Ottawa close their parks early on, and we were very concerned that that might happen here too. So, you know, it's a real positive coming out of this. But on the challenge side, we definitely see that, you know, parks that parts of the city and other GTA cities that don't have enough park space already, particularly in our densifying neighborhoods. It's really shown a light on that lack of park space and the challenges we were going to have about trying to find some of that space to meet those needs going forward. Particularly, you know, and City Building Institute has done such a good job of highlighting some of the provincial possible rule changes that will make it even more difficult to potentially create parks going forward. So that lack of green space is a real significant issue that's been highlighted because of COVID. Some other things too, that, you know, there's just been a lot of public confusion around how to use public space and can they use public space. I've been out to tons of parks and people are almost always coming up to me asking like what they can do and what they can't do. Are they allowed to use the parks? They're looking around for signs of what people are allowed to do. So there's rules around you can rest in a park, but you can't linger. And those are very confusing things. You know, signs saying park amenities are closed, but people quite naturally don't know what a park amenity is. So there's a lot of confusion around those public spaces. And again, going forward, because parks are going to be so vital in the coming months, we need to make some changes around some of that. And around some of those, it's really shone a light on some of the inequality issues around the city. So particularly with some homeless populations that maybe are using hostels or out, you know, living on the streets, that when there are these restrictions of what you can't and can't do in a public space, again, the enforcement's been done fairly well. A lot of trying to do education and talk to people, but we've also seen ticketing of homeless people using a bench. And it's just highlighted that, you know, again, for a lot of populations, parks aren't sort of a nice little necessity. These are where people spend their days, and it's a vital part of their life.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, I think it's really showing how well used our parks are and how they're critical to our health and well-being, that's for sure. And so over to you, and in terms of you know, mobility patterns and safety and how people are using city streets, what are we really seeing exposed with this pandemic?
So during the pandemic, of course, while we're all under orders to stay home, we're definitely seeing some differences in transportation. It can be hard to kind of track these with live data collection when we're all in staying home mode. So we can rely a little bit on media reports, and it looks like there's some differences depending on mode. So motor vehicle traffic looks like it's down maybe around 70%. The GO and TTC, our public transit operators, seem to be down maybe even a little more, 80 to 90%. And we don't have good ways of tracking walking and bicycling for transportation in real time. We're looking into some ways in a project led by my colleague, Linda Rothman, to do that. But what one indicator might be, for example, bike share data. So the bike share is down about 50%, so not maybe as drastic as some of those other modes. So it could be that people are turning to active transportation as some of their essential transportation as well as recreation during this time. And one of our concerns was the safety of people stepping into roadways to give distance, particularly when sidewalks in our dense urban core, many of those sidewalks are not even 2 meters to allow that 2-meter distance. And we also know that as motor vehicle volume is down, the speeds of those motor vehicles are up. And that's a safety concern, not only for risk of injury, but severity of injury. So while we might expect the overall burden of injuries to go down, the risk of injury could be affected if motor vehicle speeds are up. And so this is something we want to try to have a proactive view on. And that's part of the reason why we've been advocating for allowing more space on streets for active transportation.
Okay, great. So just to pull on that thread, I know that both of you have been working hard behind the scenes in the past few weeks to address some of these issues. So can you tell us briefly what you've been working on? And we'll start with you, and you can talk a little bit about your open letter, and then over to Dave to talk about what park people have been doing.
Okay, yeah, so my colleague Linda Rothman and I were discussing kind of the effects of what we think might happen to transportation over this time. And we're both epidemiologists who study road injury, and we are collaborating on some projects about that. And as out of these discussions, we got concerned that there are safety hazards and concerned that it might take a while before we would see the effects on injury. And that made us feel like we needed to write a letter of warning. We had also seen in public comments on the part of city officials here in Toronto, some indication that sounded a little bit like bicycling and walking were considered to be sort of optional modes of transportation. And we wanted to make sure that it was understood that many people rely on sidewalks and bicycles for their essential transportation. So those are kind of key objectives on highlighting this safety concern of writing our open letter, which we sent to the mayor and the medical officer of health for Toronto in early April, which in pandemic times feels like 2 years ago, but is really not very long ago at all.
Okay, Dave, over to you.
Yeah, and so we've been, we've got this network of community park groups right across Canada. It's like about 850 groups right across Canada, and many of those around the GTA. So we really sort of tapped into them and their networks in all their communities to really help share information about parks, particularly, again, early on in the pandemic. There was great confusion around were parks open, what could you do in them, trying to educate people around different things. So we really tapped into all their networks, and again, really reached out to different cities around the GTA about how we could help them share information. And there's, again, just as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of confusion around what you can do in parks. And we did this really fun project in Montreal with a number of other partners there called Ensemble pour nos parcs. And it was some really good public education efforts around that. We really tried to tap into, again, our network across Canada to share information around what cities around Canada were doing around lane closures, particularly to look for some of these networking opportunities for people to tap in for recreation, going out for walks, runs, cycling, so that, again, it's all new things, and trying to positively encourage different cities to be taking on some of these measures. And we're so pleased that almost every city in Canada has been taking these up, with, say, the exception of Toronto. It's been just, and again, just sort of sharing this information around, and generally pretty positive. But, and again, as I mentioned earlier about trying to work behind the scenes to keep parks open. So very concerned early on that cities were going to be shutting parks down. So again, a lot of this work behind the scenes and by pulling park people and city park staff from right across Canada to share that information, I think we were pretty successful in that.
Okay, thanks. I want to talk a little bit more about what some of these other cities are doing and how quickly they're actually implementing solutions. So the one we know that's been making a lot of the headlines is Milan, transforming 35 kilometers of streets to expand cycling and pedestrian space after the lockdown is lifted this summer. And many other cities are proposing similar measures that are either temporary or permanent, such as Berlin, Budapest, Bogota, and Mexico City. Scotland is supporting city councils to reallocate road space. Vancouver's banning cars in Stanley Park to create more space for pedestrians. France expanded roads for cycling during the pandemic, but is now adding new cycling lanes along metro lines as an alternative to transit crowding, and actually paying people for bike repairs and introducing other cycling incentives to avoid a second COVID wave. And I could go on and on. But I wanted to ask both of you, what similar opportunities do you think exist for Toronto now and post-pandemic? And are there any specific innovations in particular that could work well in Toronto going forward? Anne, how about we start with you?
Okay, sure. I just want to give a shout out to Mike Ladden, who is an urban planner in New York City. So on his Twitter, you can see he's actually sort of keeping track of what is going on in worldwide cities and what measures they're taking. And he's even got a kind of live database going in Google Docs where he's keeping track of it. And then he also kind of posts the leaderboard every so often. And in his latest leaderboard, it was Paris in the lead with 403. He's representing this in miles. So yeah, so there's a lot of exciting stuff is happening. I think one thing we can look at is that one of the concerns that public health was expressing is that they don't want there to be a crowded destination that they're encouraging people to go to. And so maybe a way to look at this is to consider a network of slowed streets that would help facilitate traveling around the city, getting to and from our parks, for example, and getting to our essential destinations and post-pandemic, our work destinations. But offering a network would help to create safe transportation and not attract as a destination.
Dave.
Well, and I think the key thing to try to remember is that this is going to be a summer unlike any other. Like there's going to be a lot of restrictions still. There's going to be a lot less options for families, for all of us to do things this summer. So we've got to grab every opportunity to think about every inch of public space, including roadways, of how they can help support people, get them outside, keep their sanity, you know, physical, mental health. It's vital for everyone. So we've got to jump on this for this summer. And the great thing about some of the things that Anne's been talking about and some of these ideas around lane closures, some of these things, is that, you know, it's almost free. Like, so it's basically, you can experiment, you can try, you know, setting up some of this network idea that Anne mentioned. And let's try it out. Let's put some pylons down and let's try it this weekend. If it does create some issues about, you know, making too much of a destination, then you can make some alterations to it. So, and it can just be for the summer. You can be playing around with it. So I think it's in a time to experiment. And I think, you know, thinking more on a more permanent going forward basis, you know, with Milan, with their great 35 kilometers about, you know, even after COVID's done, we've really got to dig deeper on some of these park linkages ideas that are out there, like great ideas like the Meadowway, linking up the Don with Rouge Park along the electricity corridor there, of a bike lane and great green infrastructure. The Green Line, you know, these linear parks and how we can create these park systems out there with land being so expensive, so that we can, you know, make more permanent some of these solutions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave. And I'm wondering, beyond the right now of what we can do in terms of temporary measures, in the longer term, what could be some of the big outcomes or lasting legacies? Like, will it be back to business as usual, or can we use this as an opportunity to accelerate improvements to the public realm?
It's so hard to think past the emergency, I find, and public health is working flat out right now to try to address this emergency. But I guess as a public health scientist, I feel like one of the things I really hope comes out of this is a greater prominence of public health in how we think about our cities. And public health is this huge, wide, cross-cutting discipline. We're seeing pieces of it now in managing infectious disease, but it's underlying, like, the thing that unites us all is about prevention. And I really hope that we're going to do more of that, whether it comes to equity, marginalized populations, accessibility, worker health, and safe transportation. And active transportation has so many benefits to public health, and we want to make it safe. So I hope that we can accelerate that part of our agenda and really kind of listen to public health about all the things public health has advice on going forward.
Dave, do you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, and just to sort of reinforce what I was saying earlier, that, I think it reinforces that, parks and networks of parks and green spaces and how we move around in a safe, creative way aren't just nice to have, they're needs to have. And we've done a good job in many parts around the GTA around this, but as our city's becoming more and more denser, we're creating neighborhoods that don't have enough green space. And it makes things like rail deck, absolutely, totally vital for the success of that neighborhood going forward. And, that it shows like that, good park infrastructure, green space infrastructure and cycling infrastructure just is absolutely mandatory in absolutely every single neighborhood around the GTA.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it makes us think about, we can't just add density without adding the park space and the public space to accommodate people even in the best of times. So I'm wondering, as we're hearing more about reopening, what reopening could look like, in the next few months, what role do you think our public spaces, both streets and parks, could play in the actual recovery efforts? Dave, do you want to start?
Well, on the recovery, and again, I think we're gonna have a summer unlike any other, and it behooves us really to get ahead of this so that we are encouraging people to get outside and we are giving them some safe options. So what about things like, we've got so many laid off workers right now. Could we be hiring some of those workers in creative ways, partnering with foundations, funders, groups like Park People, working with community groups to help educate and show people proper ways to use parks? Are there ways that we can get the playgrounds open by having them cleaned on a more regular basis? We've really got an opportunity here for people to get down and creatively think about what we have for us right now. We do need stronger park systems, things like that going forward, but we've got a lot of public space right now, and particularly if we can connect in with some of the roadways and things like that. So how can we be, with very limited amounts of dollars, getting staff and volunteers and community groups working together to maximize the opportunities for those spaces for this summer?
Okay, Anne, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of changes to transportation going forward, and it's a lot. We're still waiting for a lot of information, and we still have a lot of uncertainty about the primary routes of transmission. But we know that crowding is going to be something that we want to avoid, and outdoors is going to be something that may be even more welcomed into our lives. So we may see more meetings that we'll take outside, or we might be more inclined to go for a walking meeting rather than have indoor meetings. I can see a more prominent role of the outdoors in our future lives, and potential acceleration of some of the trends we're already seeing in active transportation as well.
Great. Okay, I'm going to end on this one quick rapid fire question for both of you. So if you were both in charge right now, what is the one thing that you would do in Toronto during the pandemic to improve the situation? And what's the one thing that you would do and make permanent? Let's start with Dave and then Anne.
So those two questions, because it was like, what would you do right away and what would you do permanently? And so right away is like on this, like getting like, so it's public education. So it's staff and volunteers out there to help make sure that we can have the parks open, combined with laneways being open. So again, so that there's staff and volunteers and support to ensure that social distancing is being met. And on a more permanent side, it is on this sort of more green infrastructure ideas like the Meadowway and other green linear parks that we need to put in place.
Okay, thanks. Anne, over to you.
I guess the first thing I would preface this by saying that I would not want to be in charge right now. I do not envy our leaders right now, and I don't envy our public health leaders. They're doing a great job, so I want to give them a shout out. I think I would, as an emergency measure, be trying to facilitate us doing some lane closures, and as Dave pointed out, we can deploy these relatively quickly when we look at our neighboring cities. And we can try to do that to make it a little bit safer for people who are relying on sidewalks and bicycles for their essential transportation right now, and as well to provide maybe a bit more room for that physical activity that we're doing. And then permanently, we want to make sure that we have safe on-street, physically separated infrastructure for people who are bicycling and walking. And we want to make sure that there's lots of room on those sidewalks. We have accessibility issues right now on our sidewalks. They're hard to navigate for people who use mobility devices. So we need expanded space for sidewalk users and safe, physically protected infrastructure for bicycle users on our streets.
And Anne, are you finding this across the board? Are there certain areas or particular streets in Toronto that are kind of in more urgent need for this?
So I'm going to also shout out WalkTO and as well Cycle Toronto are doing a good job of kind of keeping track of locations that need attention, and they're helping to relay that information back to the city. So they are a good resource if you live in Toronto and want to relay information about a neighborhood location that you're concerned about.
Right, and I think also Matt Elliott's been doing some mapping on hotspots for this as well.
That's true. He used open data from the City of Toronto Open Data, and we do have a lot of open data sort of pre-pandemic to help us look at what are high-use corridors. And also Statistics Canada only in the last couple of weeks released a new geographical map of amenities and distribution of some essential services that could help as well if we're trying to map locations.
Okay, great. Those are all really great resources. I'm going to see if CBI can tweet many of the resources that have been mentioned during this discussion. So we're at the end of this moderated discussion period, and so it's time to get some questions from the audience. And Richard has been curating these questions. So Richard, I'm going to hand it over to you for the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes, and it's the fifth of this series, and the first that I've discovered that the audience can actually help me out in the curation, as you've been doing by liking the questions. And for the longest time, the number one question that was liked with 3 likes was related to public toilets. Let me ask that question. But I'm going to ask 2 questions in a row, and you can take a crack at either one or both. But it's asked, what about public toilets? They're closed in parks and people are encouraged to go out and get exercise. Now, there's obviously maybe, considering a post-pandemic period as well, surely the need for toilets is something everybody needs. So maybe a comment on those facilities. But the number one now with 6 likes is related to POPs, publicly or privately operated public spaces that aren't the same as parks, but what possible role does private ownership play in the increased use or increased availability of what we would understand to be public spaces? So those are the 2, and then I'll keep watching these votes as they come in. That'll help me for the next question.
Okay, I'm going to ask Dave about the POPs because I know that's something that park people work on.
Yeah, and I'm not aware of any POPs that have been closed, but I do know of some of the, like the ones that I know that I've heard concerns people raising are more things like rooftop gardens and community open spaces in condominiums that condo boards in many cases have been closing those down. And so those are, vital spaces for those people. So I've heard that closed. Certainly, and so I'd be curious in the chat, maybe if people have heard about some POPs being closed, I'd like to know about it, because I think, again, there's things that can be raised in terms of, awareness so that people can use them and that they aren't closed. And that, and going forward, again, that kind of public education element around that they are public spaces and not private spaces, and make sure that they are inviting to people. But I don't know, Richard or Therese, or Anne, have you heard of any POPs actually being closed?
I wondered if this includes cemeteries.
They are closed, yeah.
Yeah, but I wondered, Dave, if you knew about this, if there's, I saw that there's discussion that maybe Mount Pleasant Cemetery might reopen.
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. It's a vital, and it's a link, with some of the cycling and to get up to the over to the what's the rail path, like the path that goes along there. So I hope that is reconsidered. It's unfortunate they've been closed.
Okay, so I'll move on. I will say this as by way of comment that in my neighborhood, the local TDSB not the playground part, which I would understand to be closed, but the broader field has also been locked up and unavailable, which I don't know if that makes a lot of sense or not. But here's the number one question right now, and it really is broader than one golf course, but let's take it as more broadly. But Don Valley Golf Course takes up a huge swath of land and is a perfect place for people to keep physically distanced while getting exercise. It is currently closed to walkers. Golf is a sport for the privileged, and we are forced to keep our distance, and other parks are closed. How can the city justify closing it to walkers? And if you want to take that more broadly as a golf course, as public space, go ahead. That's probably the date.
Okay, so yeah, we have seen other cities, San Francisco, and I think maybe at least a few others, particularly as if golf isn't allowed, then why not open them up? I think that's a great idea. And again, part of those golf courses are linked up to ravines and other green networks. So I think, and they are large spaces. So I'm less concerned about them being created as a destination. So obviously we have to be incredibly careful and thoughtful about not creating destinations, not creating public health challenges. But again, this summer, summer is very short, and it is very vital to us as Canadians to be able to get outside during that summer. And a lot of our traditional means of finding ways to recreate and enjoy summer aren't going to be available. So we better use every inch we've got.
Okay, next question that's got a lot of likes is relating to things you've talked about a little bit, but let me just see if we can pull on a couple of threads. But it's the lack of action in creating public space in Toronto, unlike other municipalities, some next door, some further afield. And it's contested here, of course, by some and health officials, other places. Question that this is not all bundled in the same question, but someone's asked, what's with the local politics here? Why are we so sensitive? I don't know if that's a delicate topic for you to address, but the other question is might there be a fear that if you were to take over some road space, let's say some car lanes, temporarily, does temporary equal really permanent in the long run? Is that, maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing?
Sounds like it's a good question for Anne.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, yes, there's an opportunity here to demonstrate the value of according that space. And I think it might be a way of looking at rebalancing the streets to kind of more accurately reflect the volumes that are passing through. And maybe that would be a helpful thing. I don't want to get into local politics, in part because I am not qualified to discuss them. But it's definitely complicated and it's hard to figure out. And we're still figuring a lot out about transmission. And I would say even in the weeks subsequent to when we wrote our letter, we're seeing a lot of different messaging on just whether it's okay to go outside. And yes, it's okay to go outside for physical activity. And yes, we have to keep our 2-meter distance. But it's changing a bit of the messaging, and that will continue to evolve.
Okay. The next question that's topped up here is related to, I think related to Dave Harvey question, and it's the tension or the question around, would you, if you had your wishes, would you rather see more small pocket parks or just, conventional sort of parks that are not necessarily linked linearly, or a larger park network in a more linear sense? What would you, if you had to put your resources, and I'm sure, and you can't, I guess you can't answer both, even though that's probably the better answer.
I would like to, it's again, we, particularly around the GTA, with so many people coming to live in our area, and that's a great thing. We have to have both, and so it isn't, and we have to have enough resources for our cities to be able to implement both. And you can do both creatively, and that includes, small pocket parks, but also, again, as Anne's talked about and others about, how can we use streets creatively to connect up some of those pocket parks so it feels more of like open. Like there's some great planning work that was done around Yonge and Eglinton, which is very, very limited in terms of green space, of how we can use side streets, green those up, make them feel almost like a linear park, even though it's a streetscape, by making a few changes to the street. There's another neat idea about Wellington Place, connecting up some parks along in the downtown, that it's still a street, but you green it up quite a bit so it becomes almost like a bit of a linear park. Or there's really cool ideas about University Avenue, about maybe doing some lane realignments, or thinking about that as some type of linear park that's still a streetscape.
Another question, somebody, I think this one's another Dave question, I apologize, Anne, but in terms of play opportunities for children, is it possible to activate play spaces for kids while remaining physically distanced in an urban setting? How do we deal with that?
Maybe that is a question for Anne, because again, I think, and again, I would encourage, park people's here all the time, and let's try to, and the great part, we can be looking at what others, every city in the world is facing these similar challenges. And, maybe again, it might result, in the good old days, there were, young people who were hired to program and be in parks and organize games and things like that. So maybe we actually need, park ambassadors or young people that we can hire as a special one-time summer thing to help, clean and organize and make possible maybe some kind of use of playgrounds if it can be done safely. And so encouraging these kind of discussions with public health and Parks and Rec and others of how we can maybe try to do something for this summer.
Anne, did you want to jump in there?
Just to say, I think we're still learning from public health, like what the risk is for surfaces transmission. And so they'll be giving us instruction on what we need to do to make those facilities available and when they might be.
There was a question around earlier around pedestrians and cyclists, and there's a lot more conflict. I think people are picking up between those two. especially as you're walking. Any ideas around how we can, especially from a pedestrian point of view, I think cyclists are, in some ways, feel very aggressive. Any comments on that?
So the concern was a conflict between cyclists and pedestrians? Is that your question?
Yeah, and I guess that you're probably thinking about paths that go through parks, not so much bike lanes per se, or sidewalks, streetcars. Sidewalks and bike lanes are well separated, obviously, but not necessarily in other parts of the network, of the cycling network. And I think there's feeling like there's some tension there. Any comment on that? How to resolve that?
I think separation of traffic can be useful even when we're talking about active modes of transportation. So having some separated offerings for keeping bicycling traffic, for example, separate from walking traffic would probably be a good thing in our parks. That might be a longer term solution.
Okay. Getting close to the last question here, but depending on how fast you answer, but Mohammed Dahani from Ryerson asks, with increasing pressure on municipal budgets, do you think cities will prioritize funding park maintenance? Are there alternative funding models that you've seen? That's a very interesting question. Scarce resources.
Yeah, and they've, basically park maintenance budgets have been kind of flatlined at the same time that we've been increasing the number of parks. So they are under pressure already, and that ultimately, it's going to need an increase in taxes to help pay for it. So that's, we are not giving the Parks Department enough resources for them to adequately maintain the parks, particularly as we ask more and more from our parks. So it's a problem.
Okay, we're getting close here. I'm going to just throw one more in here. I'm just picking a little random here, but it's a good one. Shirley Zusman, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name, is making the point that we're a winter city, that half our year is in frigid temperatures. How can we better design our spaces, our public spaces, to be more accommodating? I'm expanding on our question, but to be more welcoming in these colder times of the year, which seems to dominate even today.
Yeah, and jumping back to the maintenance thing, so I think the city's been doing a much better job of in the last 3 years of plowing some parks, so some of the pathways are clear. They've done the same thing with some of the cycling infrastructure. I think there's some creative planning to think around skating rinks. There's some really neat ovals that have been created in Riverdale Park, Greenwood, Sam Smith, that are a bit more. It's not just the regular rink. It's a much broader opportunity around that. So I think I think there's some very interesting positive things they've been trying to do around winter, and tying that in with some interesting programming ideas too about hot chocolate and fires and different activities. So supporting people to make it so it's not just go up for a quick skate, but you can take the family and have something to eat and a warm beverage and hang around the fire too.
And for on-road, I think we could look to other cities that get a lot of winter and snow. So we could look at Montreal, which has been doing innovative things around clearing bicycle lanes, for example, using brine instead of salting. And also doing regular sidewalk clearing to make sure that we can maintain that accessibility on sidewalks.
Okay, wonderful. There's a bunch of more really great questions, and we're going to harvest these, and we'll get these to make sure to Ryerson as well. Like, for example, should Yonge Street be re-envisioned only for people and bikes, a new urban park? I'll let Ryerson take that to another program. With that, though, we're bringing ourselves to a conclusion of this program, but I will pass over to you, Charisse, and then I'll have one final word at the very end about some upcoming programs.
Sure. So our next slide is just where more information and how you can track down our excellent panel. So with that, I want to extend a very warm thank you to our panel. We're very grateful for your time and thoughtful expertise, not only for this webinar, but also for getting up very early this morning for Metro Morning. So thank you, Anne and Dave. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, it was great.
Great.
And
so,
just one last, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I want to thank you, Cerise, and your team at the Ryerson City Building Institute for this series. I think it's been an amazing, timely, quick, really well attended. Hundreds and hundreds of people have dialed into each one each week. So what a great way to get our minds thinking about the future at a very challenging time. So thank you. I want to also just the next final slide, I believe, is just to point you to all to a couple of upcoming ULI webinars that are happening starting tomorrow. If we could advance one slide, please. Thank you. Tomorrow is a really interesting leadership-focused, personal leadership-focused webinar that's really in ways a prelude to a four-part series that we're doing in the coming weeks. That is something that you'd have to pay for, but tomorrow's a freebie. So check it out. And if you think it's interesting, you might want to take on, or if you're an employer, you might have an employee that would really benefit. This is we've done this program live. So this time it'll be on web. Really excellent leadership initiative. So tomorrow's a way to kind of stick your toe in for free and check it out. And then on Friday, we're kind of starting to turn to things that are not COVID related, and we're giving you an opportunity to get some expert insights into the legislative landscape changes related to the provincial policy statement and the community benefit charge, led by some of the great experts that we've convened around that program. So with that, I will close out today's webinar, and thank you all, and have a very, very great afternoon. Bye-bye.